good afternoon, and it's 4 o'clock here in London, and it's still the morning over in Colorado, where I'm delighted to be joined today by Gillian Tett, who is the chair of the editorial board and editor at large in the US of the Financial Times. But Gillian has a very strong background, as many of you will know, in anthropology, and has written a book that is really storming around and doing well. And we're here today really to talk about why AI needs another AI, why we need anthropological intelligence. Now, you'll know me, I'm Michael Mainelli, I'm one of the directors at Zen, and it really is a privilege to be able to introduce so many of these webinars because our sponsors allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And today, we're going to range across it in a slightly different way, in a way that I think we all need to pay more attention to, as Gillian will point out, really taking control of the human aspect of life rather than kind of leaving it as irrational people. There's a lovely quote which Gillian puts in her book from an anthropologist, Horace Minor, who wrote an essay on the Nakarema, which is, of course, American spelled backwards. And he said that the central task of the anthropologist is to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And so just before we get cracking, what I thought Gillian and I would like to do is to run just a tiny little poll here to get a flavor from you of your thoughts about anthropology. So do you know anything about anthropology? Yes, I studied it. Yes, a little. No, almost nothing. So the poll is up there in front of you. As I warned you, Gillian, this audience is swift. In 6 seconds, over half of them had voted. 80% have voted. I'm just going to leave it open a split second longer. And now virtually everyone's had voted, and I'm sharing those results with you. And as you can see, a little bit over half the audience says yes, a little. Not too many experts there, and 40% saying close, no, almost nothing. So just a quick reminder of the rules of the road today. I'm going to get out of the way as quickly as possible so you can hear from our expert. Gillian is going to talk for up to 20 minutes about her book, and she's got some amazing pictures to share with us. And then we'll move into a question and answer session. This session will be posted in approximately 2 working days. So I would hope sometime on Friday afternoon, you'll be able to share this with friends and family or rewatch it. And my final bit of housekeeping is please do use the GoToWebinar question facility that you see there in the chat room to send questions or comments into me so that I can feed them into a discussion with Gillian. So Gillian, very much the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Now, Michael, can you see me? Because I can still see the poll up on my screen. Can you see me?
My apologies, yes. That would help if I did that. Thank you for pointing that out.
No worries at all. Well, listen, hello everyone, and I'm delighted to be talking to you. And I'm doubly delighted that only a tiny fraction of you say you know much about anthropology, because one of the things I love doing is explaining to people who don't know anything about anthropology why their ideas about anthropology are probably wrong, and why it truly is one of the great unknown gems out there in the social sciences that anybody can employ to make sense of the world, particularly now as we try and navigate in the post-pandemic era. Most of you probably think that anthropology is all about sort of Indiana Jones, going to look at fossils and bones and exotic rituals. What I'm going to be explaining today is that anthropology is actually as much about the current world, as much about advanced industrialized contexts, about any situation where humans are congregating in groups, in tribes, if you want to use that word, where they're operating with creation myths that justify what they're doing, and that is completely endemic to any society, any group, any professional body, and where they're also operating with a range of symbols, ceremonies, and inbuilt assumptions that they've absorbed from their surroundings, which shape what they do in a very profound way. And just as people have learned in the last 10 years that you can use some of the brilliant ideas in psychology advanced by people like Danny Kahneman with his thinking fast and thinking slow framework, anybody who's a non-academic can use that to make sense of, say, how markets and finance operates. In the same way, Anybody can use the ideas in anthropology about how cultural assumptions shape us in their everyday life and work. And to understand why, it's worth starting out by referring to something that happened last week to me, which is that I gave a speech to a large group of actual AI, artificial intelligence experts, very large conference. And some of them pointed out to me that there's one thing that no AI platform in the world has yet managed to do. AI's managed to design rockets, scan markets, play Go, you name it. One thing that no AI platform can do yet is to tell a good joke. Tell a good joke. And the reason is partly because jokes are rooted in our sense of social tribes. You know, you have to be in the tribe to get a joke. If you're out of the tribe, you don't get it. But secondly, more importantly, being in the tribe is part of having a shared cultural base of ideas we absorb from our surroundings that are fluid, contradictory, very hard to define. You can't define clear-cut boundaries for a tribe or a shared set of cultural assumptions. Culture is not boxes, it's a spectrum, it's like a river, it's constantly changing with new streams coming in. But it's powerful. And if you are part of a shared cultural pattern, you're influenced to a point where you laugh with a joke. But if you're not, you don't. And no AI platform has yet managed to scan all the contradictory parts of our culture, which are so hard for us ourselves to make sense of, partly because of one other point I want to stress, which is this. AI systems, big data systems, most of the tools we use to navigate the world with are trained to look at noise. They're trained to look at the points of our world which are visible. Big data collects data on what people do. They don't look at silence, the parts of the world we ignore. That matters enormously for jokes, for what we find funny, and it also matters enormously for anybody who's looking right now at how to make their business, their own personal life, or their wider community operate more effectively in a post-pandemic world. So that all sounds very abstract. Let me give you an idea about what I mean by this through my own life, which I use as a narrative arc in my book. One of the ideas in anthropology, as Mike just said, is essentially anthropologists believe that in the same way that a fish can't see water, to cite a Chinese proverb, we can't see the cultural assumptions that shape us normally unless we jump out of our fishbowl and go and look at another fishbowl, or go and ask fish in another fishbowl to look back at us and see our water. So one of the guiding principles in anthropology is that anthropologists embrace a bit of culture shock and go to places that seem very alien or different from us, to try and look at the world afresh and gain empathy for another way of living. This is me. As an anthropologist, I did a PhD in cultural anthropology at Cambridge University back in the Soviet Tajikistan Republic in the last year of the Soviet Union. As my daughters like to tell me, I am officially old. So I went there when it was still the Soviet Union in 1989 and 1990. And I did what any anthropologist used to do, and still does to a large degree, which is to go and try and study another human cultural system and pattern by immersing myself into that life and that world, and by walking in their shoes, and by trying to really understand how they lived and thought and acted and operated. And that process of immersive observation has been core to anthropology during much of the 20th century, because anthropologists believe very strongly that there's real power in getting a bottom-up, ground-up view, a worm's eye view of the world, and trying to look at the world in a holistic way, and above all else, to go into a situation and ask open-ended questions without presuming that you know in advance what the topic you should study is going to be, or that you know what the answer is. Quite different from many other branches of social science, let alone the hard sciences. So I went off in a very classic anthropological way that probably seems very exotic to most of you watching the call, might confirm some of your stereotypes about anthropology being all about Indiana Jones. And this is me in Tajikistan with the village that I lived with, wearing Tajik clothing and living with a family up in the high mountains. Tajikistan's just north of Afghanistan. If I can have the next slide, please. And what I actually looked at there was, this is again the village where I lived and worked. It's me with the Tajik families I lived with. And then the last slide in this group on Tajikistan. Yeah, great. And what I actually studied when I was over there was Tajik wedding rituals, marriage rituals, which were an incredibly important part of everyday life. This is a set of scenes from Tajik wedding rituals. Now, if you're looking at that and thinking, wow, that's so weird, that's so incredibly exotic, how fascinating, I bet you've got some good stories to tell, but it's got nothing to do with the modern city of London or Wall Street or any other financial center. The one message I want to give you is think again. Because the second part of anthropology is that we believe that by going to look at the other, something different from ourselves, you don't just get empathy for a different way of living and a point of view, which is incredibly important in a world which is both globalized and very polarized, and where we're all exposed to the actions of others in a way that creates an ever-present risk of contagion, not just medical contagion, but financial contagion, economic contagion. And so if we don't understand others who are the source of the contagion, we are at risk of being surprised by nasty shocks. So, but anthropologists don't just believe it's worth understanding others, they also think it's worth flipping the lens and trying to look back at ourselves as an insider-outsider, or as someone who's jumped out of their fishbowl, to understand ourselves better and to see all the contradictions and challenges that haunt our own life, whether you're working on a bank trading floor or working out in or living out in Tajikistan. And I should stress this concept of the other can frankly be just somebody in the next door department to you in your own company, or someone down the end of the street. It doesn't have to be as alien or different or strange as going to Tajikistan. If I have the next slide, please.
Yes, we were just going to run a quick poll here, weren't we? So Gillian would like to ask you, do you think anthropology has any relevance to modern finance and banking systems? Yes, absolutely. Yes, possibly. Or no, not at all. So we're getting the votes up again, almost 3/4 in 10 seconds. I sort of think we're racing here. Well done all. Just going to close that and share the results with you. And as you can see, Gillian, you've got a very amenable audience with 70%. Good.
Okay, well, let me try and explain to you why I think you are all collectively right. After working in Tajikistan, I came back to London, and through a various series of accidents that I won't go into now, I joined the Financial Times. And in subsequent years, and I've been working there now for about 25 years. Once again, as I say, my daughters keep telling me I am officially middle-aged and old. But I've had a series of roles in Europe. I was economics correspondent in the UK and Europe. I went to Japan, where I ran the Japanese bureau and wrote about the Japanese financial crisis at great length. Went to the US, went to London, ran the Lex column, then ran the financial markets team. And then my last job before my current one was I was running the editorial operations of the FT in North America. So that's been a journey which has taken me into an entirely new set of tribes and tribal rituals, known what I sometimes call as the Davos tribe. Maybe familiar to some of you. There's shots of myself in the Davos tribe with people you recognize well, like Jamie Dimon and Mary Erdoes and Chelsea Clinton, on television just recently. Just last week with some of the high priests of the Davos tribe or priestly class, people like Jay Powell, Christine Lagarde, and Li Yang of China. And then if I had the last slide. Yeah. And then in my day job at the Financial Times with people like Sheryl Sandberg and the like. Okay, we can probably lose the slides because I think you get the point. But the point I want to stress is that, oh, actually, let's go back one. We don't need to ask that yet. The point I want to stress is that in the course of going through this new set of tribal cultures, if you like, the modern Western ones, what I found is exactly the same tools I once used to deconstruct Tajik wedding rituals to look at Islamic and Soviet identity can be used helpfully to look at how we operate and live in the modern business and financial world. To give you a tiny example of that, back in 2005, I took over the role of capital markets editor at the FT and went down to attend the European Securitization Forum, which is one gigantic investment banking ritual conference. I should stress that banking conferences are to the financial world what wedding rituals are to Tajik villagers. They're essentially events that group together a scattered web of human beings. They reaffirm their social ties by meeting, but more importantly, they engage in rituals and conversations and non-verbal practices which don't just reflect a worldview, a set of shared cultural assumptions, but replicate it and reinstill it as well and redefine the group. And sitting down in the European Securitization Forum back in 2005, I tried to deconstruct what I was seeing around me, which essentially enabled me to then go out and write a series of pieces predicting a financial crisis. More specifically, what I saw was that you had an investment banking securitization tribe that was shaped by a very strong sense of shared identity, spoke a language that no one else understood, CDO speak, had a sense of elitism by having virtue of control of that language. They were like a priestly class who spoke Latin and knew the congregation had no idea what they were saying in the medieval Catholic Church, but that knew that also that gave them power and thought the congregation would never rebel. They had a creation mythology, which is like any group. In this case, the creation mythology of the securitization tribe was what I call the cult of liquefaction, the idea that they were building perfectly liquid markets where risk would be dispersed by virtue of financial innovation in such a fantastic way that not only would it ensure that the system could absorb shocks by spreading and dispersing risk, but also that it would be good for all of humanity because everybody could get a loan. There were huge intellectual contradictions at the heart of that creation mythology, creation myth, like every single creation myth that defines a group, including, I should say, journalists. In retrospect, it's very clear that the idea of liquefaction, which went hand in hand with mark-to-market accounting, failed to notice that the products they were creating, CDOs, were so darn complicated that they weren't actually traded in a free market to create free market prices. And in fact, the mark-to-market accounting system often used models to mark them. Another intellectual contradiction was that dispersing risk in this way introduced new types of risk in the system because it was so opaque. Very obvious in retrospect, post-2008. At the time, people couldn't see it because they were a tribe with a shared mythology, and they were essentially isolated with tunnel vision in a ghetto. But the other point was that the tribe had a vision of finance which claimed to be about people, but there wasn't a single face in any of their PowerPoints. And they were so blinkered that, in a sense, they'd actually written out the end consequences of what they were doing on ordinary people. And many of you will have seen that wonderful movie, The Big Short, by which talks about Michael Lewis's book, where some hedge fund traders go and meet a pole dancer in Florida who's taken out a subprime mortgage and go, wow, that's what's happening. And the thing that's shocking about that is not that they saw the perversion of subprime mortgages, it was the fact that so few financiers actually went out and encountered real life in their everyday jobs because they were operating in a tribal fashion. So all of that helped me to foresee the financial crisis. And in subsequent years, I've used the same tool set intellectually, the same way of looking at the world, to look at all areas of life beyond finance. I used it to look at the technology world, Silicon Valley, which I think displays very similar patterns of tribalism, creation mythology, problems in failing to see the big picture, tunnel vision, etc., etc. I wrote columns at a very early stage talking about a techlash. I've written about it since. I've looked at many other areas of business, which I don't have time to go into now, where again it plays out. It impacts politics too. Using this toolkit enabled me to write columns at an early stage in 2016, predicting that Donald Trump could win. I've also written a lot about the tribe that I come from today, which is journalism, and the many flaws in the media world as well. I've got plenty of things wrong looking at the world as an anthropologist. I wouldn't pretend that this is somehow a magic tool. But the key idea I want to leave you with is really twofold. Firstly, I'm not arguing that anthropology is a magic wand that should replace other toolkits in your whatever cognitive toolkit you use to try and make sense of the world. I happen to think that economic models are great, very useful. Big data sets can be very useful. Corporate balance sheets can be useful, and AI is useful too. But the problem with all of those toolkits is that they are bounded by the inputs you choose to put into that model. They ignore context. Things like the environment were externalities to the economic models until recently. And if the context changes, it's dangerous. It's a bit like walking through a night with a compass, and no matter how brilliant your compass is, if you walk through that wood and just stare down at the compass all the time, you're going to walk into a tree or trip over a tree root. You have to look up and look at the context of your toolkits. And above all else, use a system of checks and balances in your own brain to try and understand the wider context of the toolkits you have. And that really is what anthropology does, by looking at the cultural context and the wider environment in a physical, cultural, cognitive sense. And my second point I want to stress is that, and on that last point, let me say that I actually regard anthropology as something which can complement economics, complement big data, complement other forms of analysis. Can't stress that strongly enough. Secondly, if there was ever a moment we should be thinking about how to use anthropology, it is right now, as we try and build back better, to use that ghastly cliche, or as we try and cope with a post-pandemic world and a world being turned upside down by technology. Because in many ways, the fact that technology is overrunning our lives is forcing us to think about the AI, the big data, all this tech. And at the same time, the pandemic has by default forced us all to embrace a tiny bit of culture shock, even if we never wanted it. You don't have to go to Tajikistan like I did to have a bit of culture shock. You don't have to walk to the end of the street and meet a strange set of people with different views, or go and talk, heavens forbid, to people in a different part of your own company to get culture shock. We've all been forced into culture shock by virtue of going into lockdown and then coming out of lockdown all over again. We've become, in a way, strangers in our own, if not land, but our own offices once again. And that is an amazing opportunity to seize the opportunity to really recognize culture matters. It's really hard to define, but it's constantly moving and it can be changed. If you ignore it, it's to your cost. If you think about it, you may actually get a better way to try and navigate the world in tandem with whatever other tools you're using to try and develop strategy and insight. So that's the basic message of my book. Thanks for listening. I think you can now get rid of the photograph of me and Sheryl Sandberg with my wonderful haircut of 10 years ago. And the last question is, would you now feel happy for your kids to study anthropology instead of accountancy? I ask that because I've often had people coming up to me in the last 10 years saying, ooh, my kids want to study anthropology, not accountancy or accounting. Will they ever get a job? The short answer, by the way, is yes. I hope you voted already, or I might have dissuaded you, but let me see whether I persuaded you.
Great. Well, I think the audience can probably guess the right answer. And let me just close that and share the results. And as you can see, kind of a whopping, was it 93% would either have a yes or, even better, hopefully both. So I think that's fantastic.
I think congratulations to the 7% of holdouts who I'm clearly not convinced. But anyway, if you're not convinced, this is the book. There's actually different versions, another sign of interesting cultural difference between America and the UK. The British version is understated in white. The American version is in the no holds barred red version. So but anyway, that link can take you to either, depending on where you are physically located.
Well, as long as everybody's testing Amazon's delivery skills, I'll leave them at it. But we have got a heap of questions and comments. Before we start, I have actually read the book, folks, and I do genuinely recommend it. It hits a brilliant tone. Gillian is also referencing many copious numbers of anthropologists working in diverse areas, such as studying janitors or shop floors and unions. It's a really, really mind-opening book on the ways in which anthropology affects things. But what I'd like to probably start with is a question here, that came in almost immediately as soon as we opened, and it's really got to do with Trevor Hilder. He says anthropology begins at home. In other words, are we all anthropologists? Really, we all study people all of the time.
We are all anthropologists now by default of lockdown, because the very fact of suddenly being kicked out of our offices and going home has forced us to realize we can't take all our rituals and rhythms for granted. So many of us have been forced to look at our own worlds afresh. And, I think we should embrace it. Sudden shocks and changes, culture shock is scary. Nobody usually, seizes on that voluntarily. But yes, thinking about life in a three-dimensional way is absolutely what we should be doing in our home environments. And just two other quick points I'll make is that there's been a huge explosion these days in discussions about D&I, diversity, equity and inclusion, and lots of people saying, oh yeah, it's great to have diverse teams at work, etc., etc. Often that's phrased as a kind of, well, we should do that, shouldn't we, for moral reasons. And yes, there are really powerful moral reasons to do this, but there's a really powerful practical reason, which is to go back to this point about checks and balances and jumping in and out of your fishbowl to understand the world. Diversity of viewpoints and lived experiences and backgrounds gives you more checks and balances intellectually in an office anyway. And that's really important.
Jeremy Taylor, an excellent question. How far is anthropology a science in the sense that it generates propositions that can be tested empirically?
Very good question. And for the most part, anthropology is not a science. It's more interpretive. It tends to work from small bottom-up observations and extrapolate from those, which obviously makes it limited. And it means that, for the reasons I said earlier, it's not a magic wand. It doesn't provide all of the answers. Sometimes anthropology can be wrong. It's part of the checks and balances in a toolkit. There are parts of anthropology which are more scientific in the sense that they try and do experiments on a large scale. And I should stress that I'm talking about cultural anthropology today, not the physical anthropology. Physical anthropology looks at bones and human evolution and how we interact with our our actual environment. That's the kind of Jared Diamond stuff. I'm talking about more the current cultural anthropology side of things. There are efforts to try and do more sort of, scientific. Anthropologists are starting to work with statisticians. Interestingly, parts of the economic profession are almost bringing on board some elements of this too, either through things like behavioral science, which is blending psychology, which has got a big overlap with anthropology, or by even looking at various sort of on-the-ground tests.
Okay.
It's quite in that respect. But yeah, I wouldn't call it a science.
Siu-Fun Hui points out that, in his opinion, my colleagues in finance studied archaeology and music, but how far are banking and trading communities also tribes? And what does looking at a banking and trading community as a tribe achieve?
I laid out a lot of this in both my previous book, The Silo Effect, and a book before that called Fool's Gold about the 2008 crash. And I talk about it in the current book too. I don't know whether you can still see me. Can you still see me, Mike?
We can't see it, but we hear you beautifully. So see if we can get that restarted. Okay. But keep going. Your sound's excellent.
No worries. And so basically, what I would argue that it absolutely pays dividends to look at banking systems and institutions through this lens. Just to give you a couple of small, very tangible examples. Firstly, any HR department has these lovely org charts about how their organizations and banking operations are supposed to work in terms of, hierarchies of people and departments, and so reports to so-and-so, and there's a great sort of shared interaction, blah, blah, blah. Anyone who's actually worked in a trading floor knows that your average trading floor works more according to the dynamics of, tribal warfare half the time, where you get certain dominant leaders who gather around them around desks, teams of acolytes. Different desks are competing with each other as much as cooperating or collaborating, often incentivized by a P&L system, which is all about eat what you can kill, or it has been in the past. And, the way that the group actually operates, the power structures are very different from what the HR org chart often shows in terms of how influence works within the system. Studying that within an anthropological lens is incredibly important. Second example, tangible, is thinking about how we interact with each other in an office setting, and concepts developed in anthropology around something called the habitus, which means the way that we interact with our environment reflects pre-existing cultural assumptions. The way we shape our environment, the way we lay out our bank offices reflects our pre-existing cultural assumptions. And by actually living in those offices, by actually engaging in our daily rituals and rhythms, we reinforce and recreate those assumptions. The fact that people, traditionally banks had back office, middle office, and front office located historically closest to the street where the customers walked in and then further away, has over time morphed into a world where people working in finance instinctively assume that those things should be separate. They're now on separate floors in many big banking skyscrapers, separated by elevators, or actually in physically different buildings. And that in turn has created a sense of social hierarchy and different social tribes inside banks, which are so natural now to financiers because they live that they very rarely question whether that makes sense, even though you can argue in many cases it doesn't make sense. But you still keep automatically replicating it every time you design a bank layout. And as we go back from being in lockdown, or as we went into lockdown, the question of how we really interact with colleagues on a trading floor, say, is fascinating because, in theory, banks should have been able to conduct a lot of their trading operations from home from around the year 2000, because so much activity moved online. And if you had a Bloomberg terminal, then basically in theory, you should have been able to send all the traders home. In practice, the opposite has happened. Banks have built bigger and bigger trading floors. And there's a wonderful anthropologist at Cass Business School called Daniel Beunza, who studied this at length by observing bankers on trading floors, who makes the point that actually the real value of a trading floor is partly through what they call sense making, non-verbal cues, picking up from the environment all these signals about what's happening in the world. And it's also because although small teams with high levels of social capital can interact well on Zoom because they have trust, what actually drives an office is the fact you have different teams which interact with each other and have what's called incidental information exchange. Daniel's worked with groups like JP Morgan to look at this, and that's the serendipity of conversations. It's people bumping into each other. And there's a reason why banks keep rewiring their trading floors and moving people around, because you instinctively know you have to keep that incidental information exchange going, and you need to keep that sense-making process going. It's been hard to replicate on Zoom. There are other benefits of Zoom, but as we go back into offices, thinking about how we interact with each other and the environment in this digital age is very, very important.
Yeah, I think we're just at the early stages of learning anything about that. That's great. Now, I'd just like to close down a small bit here on silos and then move on to interdisciplinary work. But on silos, Sanjeev Swatch wanted you to talk about, and you have mentioned it. But in addition, we've got an interesting thing here from Graham Elliott. Do you think that groupthink is an anthropological inevitability and cannot be, kind of realistically dealt with? But I think the most interesting thing, Richard Sage is here. Is there a meta issue that in most areas of specialism, most humans now don't understand most of their subject, and so tribes as a whole are more driven by salesmanship and myths rather than more by logic? perhaps as a generation or two ago?
Well, let me take the first question first, which is that groupthink is absolutely an inevitable part of being human, just in the same way that anger is an inevitable part of being human. But we don't accept the idea that we should all go out and be angry all the time. We rather accept the fact that we actually need to think about how we control anger, and think about it and teach our kids to think about it, and find ways of managing it, in the office and in our home life. We don't have a magic wand to remove anger once and forever. It's a lifetime's work. And just when you think you're getting over it, you probably go and have an explosion or something. But in the same way, groupthink is part of how we are designed to be as humans. Well, not designed, how we've evolved to be as humans. Sometimes, like anger, it can actually be useful. Small, homogenous groups can often move fast and break things, to cite Mark Zuckerberg, and get stuff done with accountability at a speed that large mixed groups can't. But there are massive drawbacks, and we need to recognize that and try and consciously counter those. In terms of the meta question about whether people are, if I understood it correctly, more removed from the people they're trying to deal with or sell to than in previous generations, if that's the question, that you've got, a sense of
he was really arguing that disciplines have become so large that people are now unable to kind of reach the edge of their discipline, let alone interact with others. And so are they being led effectively more by salesmanship and things rather than logic?
If you mean in terms of academia, are disciplines being more separated? Yes, and many of the boundaries are totally artificial, particularly in social sciences, and I hope they break down over time. If you mean that one of the problems is that in today's world we have such a complexity of knowledge and processes that people, simply to survive, tend to have a very selective tunnel vision, and create boundaries around whatever tunnel they're looking at, yes, I would agree with that too. And one of the tragedies of the modern world is that the internet gives us the illusion we're all of being hyper-connected, because we can be hyper-connected, and the possibility we can be connected if we choose, and we can have amazing access to information in a holistic way if we choose. But if is a crucial word here, because actually most of us choose most of the time not to, because the internet has also given us the ability to customize our world and our identity and our information sources to an astonishing degree. We all live in a version of the Matrix today when we go online, and we can customize what we see. And most of us, through entirely human instincts, choose to take whatever tribal affiliations we have in the real world, customize those online, and actually then intensify that tunnel vision and tribalism in a way that actually is a sort of feedback loop right now that's quite dangerous.
Okay. Bob McDowell follows on from here. He says, how would you encourage the professional tribes to interbreed? What would be the key steps? Charles Vermont is curious about interbreeding, I guess, with your views on philosophy. We also have Herbie Skeet saying at business school we were taught organizational behavior. Is this something that we should be interacting with? And Simon Dennis is sort of, where does anthropology stop and behavioral economics start? So there's this whole notion here of multidisciplinarianism. But any quick suggestions there?
I've only got through 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, first of all, that overlap between behavioral economics and anthropology. The point is that overlap between psychology and anthropology, lots of overlaps, but psychology tends to focus on the individual brains. Anthropology tends to focus more on groups, and psychology tends to assume that the human process of cognition is universal. Anthropologists tend to say actually it may not be quite as universal, the patterns, as you think, because most Western psychology is based on experiments conducted on the nearest raw material for psychology researchers, which was Western educated students. I lay out in some detail in my book why a man called Joseph Henrich thinks that actually that is an illusion to think that everyone thinks like Western educated students, because the sheer act of learning to read the Roman alphabet, say, in a sequential way, gives you a certain cognitive process and not everyone else shares. Really important. So that's one point. And secondly, in terms of the overlap between different disciplines, say, philosophy, management sciences. Again, lots and lots of overlap. It's partly about management and partly about process and methodology, the way that anthropologists do their research, and probably more focus on management science. Most of those kind of business studies tend not to take things like rituals and ceremonies and symbols that seriously, because people think rituals are a bit backward and prehistoric, a bit trivial, and they don't reflect real life. Guess what? They don't reflect real life. They reflect a kind of idealized version of real life. But that's interesting, what the ideal is. And anthropology spent a lot of time looking at the ideal, rhetoric versus reality, and trying to explore the difference and the social silence, because that matters enormously and is often very, very revealing. To go back to the tangible example I cited, the rhetoric, the creation myth, the rituals that presented this idea of the cult of liquefaction and securitization, that didn't reflect reality. There was a gap between rhetoric and reality, but that was also very revealing. There was one more question that I think you asked as well about interdisciplinary, education. 2 or 3 very quick points. 1, broad-based education matters. We should all be doing versions of the International Baccalaureate, not A-levels, for those of you in the UK. Trying to encourage that to continue at university level matters. And then in my last book, I laid out a lot of ideas about how to break down silos, both in organizations and between organizations, trying to create porous borders, trying to rotate people, trying to ensure that people have more than one affiliation inside an institution. You're a member of this department, but you're also part of a cohort of people who joined at the same time, and you meet up periodically with both to create overlapping identities and transmission of knowledge. And in the last resort, just trying to stop and think about the silos and the way that we tend to be consciously trained through the use of digital tools to go deeper and deeper into professional silos every day. I often think that kids should be taught not just about cyber hygiene, cyber bullying, cyber hacking, all those cyber issues, but about cyber tribalism too. And frankly, I think many grown-up executives should be taught about that too.
Yeah, Hugh Purser is wondering about teaching anthropology in schools without calling it anthropology. But what I'd like to wrap up is a few questions here. Paul Williams finds your presentation compelling, but are you a lone voice pushing the message uphill, surrounded by non-believing tribes? I believe Caitlin McDonald, who's an anthropologist who's appeared on our programs, says you and others have described anthropology as a way to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. Businesses often are willing to hear the first part of this, the strange familiar, and seldom the second, the familiar strange. How do anthropologists get the backing, social and funding, to keep their outsider status and provide robust critique of insider assumptions? And I think this is somewhat pointed in a question from Peter Lewis. Has any well-known organization appointed a chief anthropology officer yet? So any thoughts on that?
Okay, in the last minute of time. Last question, nope, they haven't. Some companies have employed anthropologists, usually to study their customers, not themselves. I tell many stories about how we've done this in my book. Intel spent a lot of time using anthropologists, and cite one example to look at customers, to do USX, which again has a lot of overlap here. General Motors is one of the rare ones that did actually try to look at itself with anthropologists. But almost nobody yet has actually used anthropologists to study the C-suite, for the simple reason, to answer the first 2 questions, that the messages from anthropologists about turning the lens on yourself often makes people uncomfortable, understandably, journalists included. We are full of flaws too, as a tribe. I stress that in the book. I write about all the mistakes I've made and things like that. But the fact it makes us uncomfortable is exactly why we should be doing it. Because if we don't, we're going to be forever surprised by nasty shocks and forever missing out on potential opportunities as well. And there aren't many anthropologists who are talking about this in public, partly because the discipline tends to be quite shy and retiring. The kind of people who want to study other people humbly and patiently by observing them tend not to be the kind of people who want to see the pulpit. But that's, in a way, one reason I wrote the book.
And very quickly, 10 seconds, Catherine Griffiths, which tribe would you like to study now post-COVID? In particular, maybe a tribe that you just think you could never get in and see, which you talk about in your book, the difficulty of getting into finance.
Crypto.
Crypto. Okay. Fantastic. Well, Gillian, sadly, we've come to the end of time. Folks, there have been a tremendous number of questions and comments, and they will all be sent on to Gillian with your emails so she can respond if she'd like to. And many, many thanks coming through. If I can, 3 quick rounds of thanks. Firstly, as ever, to our sponsors. If this hasn't been wide-ranging, I don't know what is. So it's been absolutely fantastic. Secondly, to you, the audience, I apologize for not having enough time to get everything in there. But I really do appreciate you making this conversation go where you wanted it to go. And finally, a reminder of some forthcoming events. In particular, we have the ever popular Raj Persaud back on Monday talking about the psychology of seduction and why it's just as important in the boardroom as the bedroom. So that'll be a fascinating and fun. But Gillian, the real thanks have to go to you, dialing in from the States and everything, and coming and sharing with us what you've been working on. And I can't recommend your book more heartily than simply say it was the most enjoyable read for me. Unfortunately, technologically, one other anthropological thing we've not yet figured out how to do is how to give warm equivalent technologically for applause. But I have here a Korean karmic clapper, which I use as my ersatz substitute here. And that will have to do, but at least it's an anthropological tool as well from a Buddhist temple. So thank you very much, and we hope to hear from you again soon in the future.
Thank you very much indeed for listening to all of you. Thank you.